welcome back to New Amsterdam Radio, the podcast for creatives, thinkers, and doers. It is I, the mayor, Flobo Boys, high up top the mayor's office, chatting with those who are doing extraordinary things. Now, long-term listeners of the show know I love sitting down and chatting with authors because they have the keys to so many different fiction or nonfiction stories within their minds. But my guest today is doing it big. Please welcome Don Hill to the show. In fact, so many books in your bibliography as it is, and more keeps growing every day. How's it going, sir?
Good. Thank you, Mayor, for having me on your podcast show. I'm honored.
You know what? I am also having the time of my life here as well. Let's get right into brass tacks. You know, the first book series that came across my desk, and is only a sliver of what you've already written, was the Vampiro series. And it does take an interesting look at what vampirism is. Talk to me about how that book came together.
Oh, very good. To be honest with you, I'm not a big fan of the genre of science fiction. I had a friend of mine who has subsequently passed away, my co-author on the Vampiro series, Tom Cavaretta. He was a pharmaceutical rep, and he grew up in the Southwest, specifically in the El Paso area, where there was a long tradition of curanderas, faith healers, and the myth of vampirism, which apparently is a fairly universal concept throughout the world. You pick a culture and you dig deep into it, and you'll see that there is mythology about humans that prey upon others. And he wanted to know if perhaps I could come up with a plausible scientific thesis on how human vampirism could arise.
Was that a dare?
And I took a different course of action when Tom talked me into collaborating with this work of fiction with him, not based on the Faustian model where an individual sells his soul to the devil for temporal earthly benefits. I decided to try and tackle this as a real disease process. And I'm not claiming to be prescient or anything, but we started this process right when the COVID-19 outbreak started 5 years ago. And it kind of dovetailed into what could have been a terrible pandemic. And we hypothesized that perhaps there's an RNA virus that could actually warp the human genome to where human beings that are infected are no longer able to make their own hemoglobin molecule, which is necessary to carry oxygen in red blood cells. And in order to survive, there had to be an exogenous source of hemoglobin, basically feeding on other mammals or birds to harvest blood that is reincorporated into production of new red cells. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but as you well know, human beings are a broad cast of different individuals, some good, some bad, and some in between. And this work of fiction shows that as a disease process, there's good folks that could get this and who try to live a noble life, and there's bad folks with bad intent. And we got through the first two volumes of Vampiro without much difficulty. But during the COVID outbreak, Tom Cavaretta, my co-author, died in the spring of 2020. I hadn't heard from Tom in about 6 weeks. We were ready to start the third and final installment, and he was doing some research that he had completed. And as the work of fiction was structured, I wrote the main body of the fiction. Tom wrote about 20% of volume 1 and volume 2, and I was committed to write the rest of the fiction. And after I hadn't heard from Tom for a while, I said, "What the heck? Is Tom on vacation or what?" And I finally got a hold of his wife, Marcy, and I was absolutely stunned that he got sick and died within 24 hours of having an acute illness, presumably COVID. And I was in a serious blue funk for a couple of months. And I thought, man, I got to dust myself off. And if I'm going to finish this, it's going to have to be on my own. So the third volume, the third installment of of the Vampiro Trilogy I wrote without the assistance of Tom, although I did give him co-author credit. And Tom and I did this on a handshake. We didn't have a contract between us, but I vowed to his wife, Marcy, that if this ever becomes a commercially successful endeavor, that I will be sure and share the harvest that hopefully will come someday if this ever becomes a hit work of fiction, or perhaps made into a celluloid for a motion picture.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, because not only did you honor that gentleman's agreement, what resulted really was a fresh take on the genre, and that's why I wanted to ask you also about another work of fiction that you wrote, the Menehune. Is that the pronunciation correct? Uh,
Sure.
it definitely the way you approach the layers of fiction. Is it definitely intentional, or is it your spark of creative ideas just happens to come from the ether? They mean a different kind of lens compared to other authors, because this feels
Well,
like you have something fresh.
the Menehune was actually a novella. It's only 2 chapters. It's basically an extended short story. It's about a 60-page novella. And what inspired me was actually living in the Hawaiian Islands for the better part of 5 years. I've been doing locum tenens work as a physician for the last decade. I was actually in practice here in Arizona, where I still live as my permanent home. And I had a practice here that unfortunately financially failed. I had a co-partner who was 22 years my junior, and she had a little boy. I won't go into a lot of details, but he acquired cancer and he died a horrible death. And he was 6 years old when he passed away. And my partner, she felt that perhaps this was some punishment from God or the universe for crimes that she may have committed in a prior life. And she walked away from the practice with instructions that she should not be found. And I was caught flat-footed. I tried for a couple of years to recruit somebody else to replace her here in Casa Grande, because we built a big 12, 15,000 square foot freestanding cancer clinic on our own accord. And after 2 years, without being able to find a replacement for her, all of a sudden I'm 2.5 million in the hole. And that becomes sort of like real money. And and I was aware I was in trouble financially when large moving vans started coming up and hauling off all of the equipment. And so I decided, well, if I'm going to continue working as a physician, I could never subject myself to the risk of running my own business ever again. I wasn't trained in business, and obviously I failed at it miserably. So to resurrect my medical career, I've been doing locums tenens work, which is basically doing temporary jobs hither and yon. And so I'll take on 6-month to 1-year contracts here and there. And that's how I've continued my medical practice. And one of the first spots that I stopped at in my resurrection of my medical career was in the state of Hawaii. I spent 2 years on the island of Maui and another 3 years on the Big Island, and enjoyed myself there. And while I was there, I learned in depth about the myth of the Menehune, who apparently lived on the Hawaiian Islands prior to the arrival of the Polynesians about 1,000 years ago. Now, from what the folks in Hawaii that were native Polynesians, that whose ancestors had lived there for centuries, there was internecine warfare between the Menehune, who were apparently diminutive folks, but warlike nonetheless. And in the end, the Polynesians conquered and defeated the Menehune, theoretically driving them into extinction. But is that really the case? When I was working in Hawaii, doing my locum tenens work at that lovely island, I became aware of an encounter that a school teacher had with his class during the 1940s, around the time of the end of the Second World War. And this happened on the northern island of Oahu, where his name was